Dean told me I was as boring as a library card catalog the night he left. I am a rare book librarian, and a very good one. 11 weeks later, I inherited my great-aunt Cordelia's entire manuscript collection and discovered his new fiancée's real legal name doesn't match a single document she's shown him. It matches one, though: my aunt's estate paperwork. I haven't told him that part yet. Right now, 6 weeks into cataloging a collection worth more than his entire firm's annual bonus pool, I let him go on believing exactly what he already believes about me: that I am precisely the small, careful, unremarkable woman he described to his lawyer during the divorce. A woman who reads other people's old letters for a living because she never worked up the nerve to write anything of her own. He is not wrong that I read other people's letters for a living. He is wrong about absolutely everything else. What he called boring, I have always called precision. There is nothing dull about holding a 400-year-old secret in your hands and being the one person in the room who can actually hear what it's trying to tell you. Dean wanted a life that moved fast enough he never had to sit still with anything, including eventually me. I have never once regretted being the kind of woman who sits still long enough to notice what everyone else missed. I work at the Copley Research Library, 3 blocks off Copley Square, in a reading room that smells like leather and cold coffee, and on good days like nothing at all, which is the exact smell of a room doing its job properly. I have spent 11 years learning how to tell a real 1850s binding from a very good 1970s fake by smell alone. Adhesive doesn't age the way people think it does. Neither, it turns out, do people. Beacon Hill keeps its old money the way old money prefers to be kept: behind gas lamps and uneven brick sidewalks and a specific, practiced kind of silence about what anything is actually worth. My aunt's townhouse fit right in, from the outside. Nobody walking past it would ever have guessed what was quietly happening inside it for the better part of 3 years. Last spring I spent 4 months proving a supposedly lost Revere-era pamphlet in a client's estate was actually a 19th century reprint, using nothing but the wove pattern of the paper and a magnifying loupe, and saved a Beacon Hill family from donating a worthless fake to a museum as though it were a masterpiece. Nobody at that family's dinner table thought to call that boring. They called it a small miracle. Dean was not at that dinner table. Dean was rarely at any table where my work actually mattered to someone. My great-aunt Cordelia Ashdown lived 4 blocks from my library her entire adult life, and I met her in person exactly 6 times. The 4th time, I was 26 and newly married, and drove out to Beacon Hill uninvited with a bottle of good sherry, and the foolish hope that marriage might finally earn me an invitation past her front hall. She let me as far as the parlor, poured 2 glasses, asked exactly one question about Dean in a tone that told me she'd already formed an opinion, and spent the next 90 minutes teaching me how to identify a genuine 18th century marbled end paper by the exact pattern of its veining. She never told me whether she liked him. I understand now that the silence was the answer. We wrote letters instead, starting when I was 11, after she sent my grandmother a card that included, almost as an afterthought, a single line meant for me: tell the child that if she likes books that much, she should learn to read the ones nobody else wants to. I wrote back. She wrote back faster than any adult in my life ever had. For 22 years, in her small, slanted handwriting, she taught me more about paper and ink and provenance than any class I ever paid tuition for, 1 letter at a time, without ever once inviting me inside her actual house. When I told her, at 22, that I'd gotten into library school and my mother thought it was a waste of a perfectly good English degree, she wrote back 4 words on a postcard of the Boston Athenaeum: "Your mother is wrong." I taped that postcard inside my very first reference desk drawer, and every desk drawer I've had since. "Books don't lie," she wrote to me once when I was 15 and furious about something small. "People do. That's why I trust the paper over the person holding it, every single time." I did not know, the week she died quietly in her sleep at 89, how much I was about to need to remember that. She left me everything: the townhouse, 4 blocks from my own building, 1,140 volumes by the estate's initial count, and a guest ledger by her front door that every single visitor, in 20 years, had been made to sign in longhand, because Cordelia believed, with total sincerity, that a house full of books ought to keep its own record of who'd touched them. I did not yet know how much that particular eccentricity was about to matter. Harold Bramwell, my aunt's solicitor of 30 years, read the will in his office on a Thursday, 3 weeks after I'd moved the last of my clothes out of the house Dean and I used to share. He looked at me over his glasses when he reached my name in the document, as though checking it was spelled the way he remembered from her letters, and told me, when we finished, that Cordelia had updated that will 4 times in the last decade of her life, and my name had been on every single version, unchanged, since the year I turned 22. Everyone else's name moved around a great deal, he added, not unkindly, yours never did. I did not know what to do with my face in that office, so I did the thing I always do when I don't know what to do with my face. I asked a technical question. How many of the 4 versions actually named the guest ledger specifically? I asked, and Harold, bless him, did not comment on the strangeness of the question, and simply told me, all 4. Dean and I had been married 7 years when he told me, in the kitchen of the house we'd bought together, that he needed a life, not a reading room. He said it kindly, the way people say cruel things they've rehearsed in the car on the way home. He said I was as boring as a library card catalog, and that Camille made him feel like he was actually living, for once, instead of just cataloging his own life from the sidelines. It had been coming for a while, in the way those things always are, and somehow still catch you flat across the face. Months of him coming home later than his own excuses could quite explain. A year, probably, of him wincing very slightly every time I mentioned a new acquisition at work, like it was a personality flaw I could still be talked out of. Camille, he told me, made her own hours, ran her own consulting practice, never once had to check a reading room schedule before agreeing to dinner. I did not point out that I had never once needed his permission for anything either. I simply hadn't needed to ask. That, I understand now, might have been part of the problem. He was not always like that. 9 years ago, when we first met, he drove 45 minutes out of his way after our second date to help me carry 11 boxes of a deceased colleague's personal library up 3 flights of stairs, without complaint, without once checking his phone. I think about that version of him sometimes still, the way you think about a book you loved once and can no longer quite remember why. I did not cry in front of him. I have spent 11 years learning to hold my face perfectly still while looking at something that might be a forgery. It turns out to be a far more transferable skill than anyone tells you in library school. I cried later, obviously alone, in the guest bathroom with the water running so the sound wouldn't carry, which felt, even in the moment, like something out of a novel I would have gently mocked a patron for reading. Then I got up, washed my face, and drove to the library at 11 that night. Because a 19th century diary was due back to a donor in the morning, and grief, it turns out, does not actually cancel your professional obligations, however much you might privately wish it would. I cried plenty in front of Priya Chandran though, my closest friend since our first week of library school together, currently head of conservation 2 floors up from my own desk at the Copley. She showed up at my new 1-bedroom the night I signed the lease with a bottle of wine, a box of the good tea I like, and absolutely no interest in pretending Dean's timing wasn't insulting on top of everything else. He left you the same season you inherited a fortune in rare books, she said, curled into my one decent armchair, and somehow you're the one who's supposed to feel embarrassed at parties. Explain that math to me again. I can't, I told her. Nobody's ever been able to explain that particular math to me either. She is the only person besides Cordelia who has never once, in 15 years, made me feel strange for loving something as unglamorous as paper. I did not know yet how much I was going to need exactly that kind of friend before the year was over. 3 weeks after the funeral, cataloging my aunt's collection room by room for the insurance appraisal, I found the first thing that didn't sit right. The townhouse had smelled like her within a week of me having a key. Bergamot tea and old vellum, and the particular dust that only settles on a house where every surface is shelf. I spent the first several days just walking the rooms without touching anything, the way you're supposed to survey a site before you excavate it, notebook in hand, doing nothing but looking. Her study still had a half-finished cup of Earl Grey on the desk, gone entirely to dust, that I could not bring myself to move for the better part of a month. Some grief is enormous and abstract, some of it is just a teacup. A small, hand-illuminated herbal, dated in the colophon to 1690, one of maybe 4 surviving copies in the world, its blues so vivid I actually laughed out loud alone in that dusty parlor. It was beautiful. That was the whole problem. It was too beautiful, in exactly the wrong way, the specific gleaming confidence of something that had never spent 4 centuries doing what paper actually does to itself when nobody's watching. Prussian blue wasn't invented until 1706. I stood there a long time, doing the math twice, the way you do math twice when you badly want it to come out different the second time. It didn't. Camille Rourke walked into my old kitchen 11 days after that, to help Dean collect the last of his golf clubs, wearing a blazer that cost more than my monthly mortgage and a smile clearly designed for rooms with better lighting than mine. Dean tells me you're some kind of librarian, she said, glancing around at my shelves like they were a mildly sad hobby. That must be so cozy. I could never sit still that long. She picked up a framed photo from my side table without asking Cordelia and me at some ribbon-cutting years back, studied it a beat too long for idle curiosity, and set it back down slightly crooked, the way people do when they've actually been listening the whole time and would very much like you to believe otherwise. I told her it takes a great deal of sitting still to notice when something's wrong with a 400-year-old book. I did not tell her I'd already noticed something wrong with a 400-year-old book. I have spent 11 years learning exactly when to say the true thing out loud and when to let someone believe they've already won. She said something about how sweet that was, in the specific tone people use for children and golden retrievers, and left with Dean's golf clubs and, I would later confirm, absolutely nothing that legally belonged to her yet. She texted me twice in the weeks after that, unprompted, unnecessary, the kind of message designed less to communicate anything than to remind you someone is thinking about you in a way you never asked for. So sorry about your aunt, the first one said, 3 weeks after the funeral, though we had never once discussed Cordelia in a way that would have told her the timing mattered to me at all. I didn't respond to either message. I have spent 11 years learning that silence is sometimes the most precise answer available. The estate's insurance company insisted on a second, independent appraiser before final valuation, which is how Julian Ferris ended up standing in Cordelia's parlor 2 weeks later, holding the same fake herbal up to a UV lamp with the specific, quiet delight of a man who genuinely loves catching a good forgery. Whoever did this was talented, he said, turning the page carefully. Wrong century, wrong pigment, but the right kind of talented that makes me nervous about what else in this house isn't what it claims to be. He'd brought his own portable UV lamp in a case that looked like it belonged to a far more glamorous profession, and a magnifying loupe he wore around his neck the entire 2 hours he was there, forgetting to take it off even when we stopped for coffee. I asked him how long he'd been doing forensic appraisal work. Long enough to stop being surprised by people, he said, and just short enough to still be surprised by the paper. I have never once, before or since, heard anyone describe my exact job back to me that precisely on a first meeting. I liked him immediately, the uncomplicated way you like someone who gets excited about exactly the thing you're excited about, instead of politely waiting for you to stop talking about it. We found 6 more over the next 10 days. The Psalter was the one that actually got to me. 16th century, supposedly untouched since a Cambridge parish sold off its library in the 1920s, its spine repaired at some point with what looked, under Julian's lamp, exactly like ordinary 20th century wheat paste, the kind you could still buy at any hardware store on Newbury Street. I sat on the parlor floor with that Psalter in my lap for a long time, not cataloging anything, just holding it, thinking about how many quiet afternoons my aunt must have spent with this exact book in her own lap, trusting it completely, the same way she'd trusted whoever fixed that spine for her. A bundle of 18th century letters came next, the paper glowing faintly, unmistakably blue under the UV lamp, a modern optical brightener that has existed for about 70 years total sitting quietly inside paper that was supposed to predate the United States. Whoever had done this hadn't emptied the collection all at once, they'd taken their time. Years, probably one careful swap at a time, the exact patient method of someone who understood that a librarian eventually checks everything, and was betting on getting out before that librarian turned out to be me. Julian and I ate dinner standing up in Cordelia's kitchen most nights that week, takeout containers balanced on stacks of acid-free folders, arguing cheerfully about whether a particular binding style was Florentine or just a very good Boston imitation of one. He lost that argument. He conceded it graciously, over the last of the dumplings, and told me it was the first time in 4 years of doing this work that he'd actually wanted to keep being wrong about something, just to keep hearing me explain it. I did not know what to do with that sentence for several days. I am still not entirely sure I know what to do with it now, except that I have noticed I look forward to Tuesdays specifically, because Tuesdays are when he comes by to review that week's findings, and I have started making enough coffee for 2 without ever quite deciding to. The guest ledger sat on Cordelia's front hall table the whole time, 400 pages of names in longhand, mostly researchers and a handful of dealers, twice a year like clockwork, a plumber. I did not think to actually read it front to back until a Tuesday night 3 weeks into the investigation, unable to sleep in my new apartment, needing something to do with my hands that wasn't staring at the ceiling, replaying Dean's exact wording from the kitchen. I made tea I didn't drink and sat at my own small table, with 400 pages of other people's handwriting, the way I have sat with other people's handwriting my entire professional life, and started reading names I mostly didn't recognize, going backward from the most recent entry, which happened to be my own, 6 weeks earlier, the day I'd come to collect the will. D. Kessler, independent appraiser, appeared 11 times over 3 years, always alone, always in the afternoon, in a small, careful hand that leaned hard to the right. I did not know a D. Kessler. I knew a Camille Rourke, who had told my ex-husband, in front of 200 wedding guests at their engagement party I was not invited to but heard about anyway, that she worked in art and antiques consulting and had simply never had the patience for anything as slow as a library. Julian ran the name through the regional appraiser's registry the next morning while I stood over his shoulder trying to breathe normally. Donna Kessler. Licensed for 6 years, suspended for 2, 3 unresolved client complaints involving items that went missing during private in-home appraisals, no forwarding address on file since her suspension began. I sat down without meaning. Julian didn't say anything for a moment, just turned his laptop screen fully toward me so I could read the suspension notice myself. 3 client names blacked out for privacy. 3 dates spanning almost exactly the years my aunt's guest ledger showed regular visits from a D. Kessler, independent appraiser. Her signature on the license application, notarized and scanned into the registry's database, leaned hard to the right, in a small, careful hand. Here is what I did not know yet, and only pieced together afterward, the way you reconstruct a fire from where the smoke stains the ceiling. I will tell it the way it actually happened, not the way I first assumed it had. Donna Kessler had spent 6 years quietly working reclusive collectors up and down the eastern seaboard, always the same patient method. Get invited in as an appraiser, get trusted, swap the rarest pieces for careful forgeries, one at a time, slow enough that nobody counted twice. Sell the originals through her brother Victor's small private dealership outside Providence, which specialized on paper, in estate liquidations nobody looked at too closely. She was 3/4 of the way through Cordelia Ashdown's collection when the old woman died in her sleep, 11 weeks before a phone call Donna made to a probate researcher she kept on retainer for exactly this purpose. The researcher told her the entire estate, unclaimed pieces and all, was going to a great-niece named Nora Faircloth, married, Beacon Hill adjacent, a rare book librarian herself, which was either the worst possible luck or the best possible opening, depending entirely on how fast you could get close to her before she finished counting what was left. She had called her brother that same night from a parking lot outside the probate court, 3 days before she ever laid eyes on Dean Pemberton in person. Married, she told him, reading off her own notes. Rare book librarian herself, so she'll know exactly what she's looking at eventually. We move faster than usual, or we don't move at all. Victor, who had spent 4 years quietly moving whatever she brought him without ever once asking a question he didn't already know the answer to, reportedly said only one thing back: how fast is faster? She had done this 4 times before Cordelia Ashdown, in 4 different states, under 4 different careful names, always reclusive collectors, always people whose families had mostly stopped visiting long before anyone thought to ask why. She was, by every account I've since gathered, extraordinarily good at being whoever a lonely person most needed her to be, for exactly as long as it took. Donna found Dean Pemberton at his gym 4 days later. She did not fall for him, she selected him the way you select a lock you've already measured. I know all of that now. I did not know a single piece of it the week she showed up in my kitchen holding my ex-husband's golf clubs and calling my whole life cozy. Cordelia's memorial reception filled the Copley's smaller reading room 2 months into all of it, mostly former researchers and a scattering of distant cousins who'd suddenly remembered how fond they'd always been of her. Priya stood next to me the entire afternoon like a bodyguard who'd brought excellent, Horsdover's opinions instead of a weapon. Dean came, I had known he would, I had not fully braced myself for who he'd bring. "Sweetheart," Camille said, her voice pitched low and pleasant enough that only I could hear it. "Some women get the man, some women get the books. I always did think you got the better end of that deal, honestly. Books don't talk back." I smiled and told her I'd always found that to be their best feature. I told Dean everything I knew 3 days after the memorial, sitting across from him at a coffee shop he chose specifically because it wasn't ours anymore. I laid out the pigment, the wheat paste, the optical brightener, the ledger, suspended license, in the exact order I'd used defending an attribution to a skeptical donor. "Nora," he said before I'd even finished, "you have to hear how this sounds. Your aunt just died. You're going through a divorce. And now the woman I'm marrying is secretly some kind of criminal mastermind who's been robbing a dead woman blind for 6 years. Do you hear it?" "I hear it," I said. "I also have the paper." He listened for exactly as long as it took him to decide he didn't want it to be true, and then he told me gently, the way he tells people things he's already decided, that grief does strange things to a person's judgment, and maybe I should talk to someone. I did not raise my voice. I have spent 11 years learning that the fastest way to lose an argument about evidence is to sound like you need someone to believe you. He mentioned our conversation to Camille that same night. I know because 4 days later I let myself into the townhouse to retrieve a volume for Julian and found the front hall table bare, the guest ledger simply gone, no sign of forced entry, because Camille still technically had a key from her visits as D. Kessler that nobody had ever thought to collect back. That same afternoon, Victor Kessler's dealership quietly delisted 11 items from its upcoming private sale catalog without any explanation at all. I stood in that empty hallway furious at myself for one panicked moment before I remembered. I had already photographed every single page 4 weeks earlier, on a night I couldn't sleep, for no reason I could have explained out loud at the time, except that Cordelia had taught me to always make a copy of anything that mattered. Word reached me sideways not long after, the way these things always do, through a colleague who'd heard it from a donor who'd heard it from someone at Camille's own engagement party. Nora Faircloth apparently had taken the divorce very hard. Was seen making wild accusations about her ex-fiancé's replacement out of, and I quote a version of this that reached me third hand, sheer professional jealousy over a collection she clearly felt entitled to and hadn't earned. Priya heard it too, and marched into my office holding her phone like a weapon. "I already told 3 people it's insane," she said. "Do you want me to tell more people? Or do you want to just show them the actual paper?" "Show them the paper," I said. "Always show them the paper." The breaking point came on a Tuesday in Julian's office, looking at high-resolution scans of 11 ledger signatures next to a licensing application signature and a forged herbal colophon. 3 separate documents, 3 separate crimes, one single hand that leaned hard to the right in all of them. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and colder than that, the specific stillness of a woman who has just finished counting and knows, for certain now, exactly how much was actually taken. I thought about the postcard taped inside my very first reference desk drawer. "Your mother is wrong." I thought about 90 minutes in a parlor with a glass of sherry, and a woman who never once told me whether she liked my husband, and I understood, sitting in Julian's office at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, exactly what my aunt had actually been trying to teach me for 22 years. Not simply how to read paper, how to trust what the paper told me over what a person said out loud. I called Harold Bramwell, my aunt's solicitor of 30 years, that same afternoon. "Whatever you're about to do," he said, after I explained it, "I would very much like to help you do it properly." He arrived at my apartment 40 minutes later with a legal pad and the specific calm of a man who has spent 30 years being the only adult in rooms full of grieving, furious families. "We are not going to accuse anyone of anything," he told me, laying out the pad, "until we can prove it 6 separate ways to 6 separate skeptical people. Sentiment loses in court, paper wins." It was, I realized, almost word for word what Cordelia used to write to me at 15. I did not tell him that. I simply nodded and started making a list. We planned it around the collection's public dedication, 6 weeks out, the ceremony where the Copley Research Library would formally receive Cordelia's donated volumes and open them to researchers for the first time in her memory. Camille had already RSVP'd on Dean's arm, eager, Harold told me, to see the collection formally handed over in public, which told me everything about how confident she still was that nothing had been noticed. 4 days before the dedication, her lawyer sent the library a cease and desist, claiming Cordelia had verbally promised Camille 3 specific volumes as a personal gift, witnessed, he wrote, by close friends present at the time. The library's board, understandably nervous about litigation at a public event, called an emergency session and asked Harold whether the ceremony should be postponed. For about 6 hours it looked like it might be. I sat in the Copley's boardroom and listened to 7 people who had never once handled a rare book discuss, in careful legal language, whether the safest thing to do was simply wait. Wait for what, I finally asked, and the room went quiet. Wait for her to finish selling what's left before anyone's brave enough to say her name out loud in public? Nobody answered that directly. The board chair asked Harold, instead, how quickly we could actually prove any of it beyond what I'd already told them. I did not sleep at all that night, not from focus this time, but from something closer to fear, lying in the dark running through every version of the next morning where the board simply decided caution was the safer bet, where Camille walked into that reading room and out again with nothing worse than a delayed lawsuit and a very good story about my jealousy. Julian finished the full forensic report at 2 in the morning the night before the dedication. Handwriting analysis on the fake gift letter Camille had produced as proof, the same right-leaning hand, the same signature that didn't match a single document she'd shown Dean for their own marriage license application, currently sitting unsigned in a drawer Dean didn't know I knew about. Paper dating on all 7 forgeries, a full sales history from Victor Kessler's dealership, cross-referenced against the missing ledger pages I'd photographed. Harold walked it into the board chair's office at 7 that morning. The dedication proceeded as scheduled at 6 that evening. 200 guests filled the Copley Research Library's main reading room, press included, for what the program described as a celebration of one collector's lifelong gift to the public. Camille arrived in cream silk on Dean's arm and took a seat in the second row like a woman who'd already won. Priya found my hand backstage 30 seconds before I was due to walk out, squeezed it once, hard, and said only, "Paper wins," in a tone that made it clear she'd been paying closer attention to my rambling about Harold than I'd realized. Julian was already seated in the third row, forensic folder in his lap, looking for all the world like a man attending a perfectly ordinary lecture, which was, I understood, exactly the point. Harold introduced me simply as the collection's new custodian, without a single word about anything else, exactly as we'd planned, so that when I walked to the podium, the room was still expecting nothing more dramatic than a nice speech about a dead woman's generosity. "I want to thank my great-aunt Cordelia Ashdown," I told that room, standing beside 1,140 volumes that were, as of that morning, once again fully and completely accounted for. She taught me in a letter when I was 15 years old that books don't lie, people do. I did not understand until this year how literally she meant that. I held up the fake herbal first. This piece claims to be from 1690. It contains Prussian blue pigment, which did not exist until 1706. Someone with real skill made this forgery, and real access to my aunt's home to make the swap. I held up the guest ledger pages next, projected large enough for the back row to read the name themselves. D. Kessler, independent appraiser. 11 visits over 3 years, always alone. Suspended license, unresolved theft complaints. A signature that matches, stroke for stroke, the woman sitting in the second row of this room right now, using a different name for a different kind of access. "I have one more piece of paper," I said. "The marriage license application currently sitting, unsigned, in my ex-husband's own desk drawer, filed under yet a third name I won't read aloud in front of the children in this audience. 3 names. 3 sets of paperwork. 0 of them match each other, and exactly 1 of them matches my aunt's estate documents, filed the week before she died." The room did the thing rooms do when 200 people realize, at exactly the same moment, that they are watching something real happen. Somebody's phone camera clattered to the floor. A reporter near the aisle was already typing before I'd finished my sentence. Somewhere in the crowd, unmistakably, I heard Priya mutter, "Oh, she is finished," loud enough that 3 people near her actually laughed, the wrong kind of laugh, the kind that happens purely because a room needs somewhere to put that much sudden tension. Camille was on her feet fast, already talking, already reaching for outrage, and Dean, beside her, had gone the specific white of a man doing math he badly wanted to come out different. "That's slander," she said, loud enough to carry and completely unprovable. Julian stood up from the third row with a folder of his own. "Actually," he said mildly, "it's a forensic document comparison prepared for the estate's attorney, and as of this morning, the district attorney's financial crimes unit, given that Ms. Kessler's dealership has also been selling stolen cultural property across state lines for at least 3 years. It's extremely provable, I did it myself." Camille turned to Dean, fast, reaching for his arm. "Tell them this is insane," she said. "Tell them you know me." Dean did not move his arm toward her. He also did not move it away. He simply stood there, holding his wine glass, saying absolutely nothing, which I suspect was the single most honest thing he had done in front of an audience in the entire 7 years I'd known him. 2 Boston PD detectives, whom Harold had quietly invited as guests rather than announced as detectives, stood up from the back row at exactly that moment, which told me Harold had thought of literally everything, and I made a mental note to send him something better than a fruit basket. Dean did not come to my defense that night. He also notably did not go to hers. He stood very still in the second row while his fiancée was escorted out for questioning, holding that wine glass he never once remembered to set down, looking, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely boring, the exact word he had once used on me. Harold found me afterward in the stacks, where I'd retreated the moment I could politely disappear. "Your aunt is having an extremely good night, wherever she is," he said. I believed him completely. 3 weeks later, Victor Kessler's dealership was formally shut down pending trial. 7 original volumes recovered from a storage unit outside Providence still in their original bindings, untouched. Camille, whose passport, it turned out had been issued under a third name entirely, was charged with grand larceny, forgery, and interstate trafficking in stolen cultural property, and denied bail as a flight risk. Dean's name appeared in exactly one paragraph of the coverage, described, with what I choose to believe was editorial mercy, as unaware. He called me twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail. I am not, it turns out, actually as interested in his side of this particular story as 11 years of very good manners had led both of us to assume I would be. Priya sent me a single text that night, at midnight, that just said, "Your aunt would have loathed this," followed 4 minutes later by a second text clarifying, not the theft part obviously, the part where you stood up there and were right about everything and 200 people who doubted you. I read it probably a dozen times before I fell asleep. The Ashdown collection opened to researchers on a Monday morning 6 weeks after that, quietly, the way my aunt would have actually wanted it, no ceremony, no cameras, just 1,140 real volumes and a line of graduate students at the door by 9. Julian brought coffee that first morning, the good kind, and sat with me in the reading room an hour before opening, going through a newly acquired box of my aunt's correspondence nobody had catalogued yet. "She wrote you a lot of letters," he said, holding one up to the light out of pure habit now, checking the paper the way I do, the way I taught him to without ever quite deciding to teach him anything. 22 years of them, I said. She was the only person who ever told me the truth on purpose. He didn't ask what I meant by that. He just handed me the letter, carefully, by the edges, the way you hand someone something you already understand is worth more than it looks. He has started leaving his reading glasses on my desk on purpose, I'm fairly sure, so he has a reason to come back for them at the end of the day. I have started letting him. Priya stopped by that same week with a housewarming plant for my new office, took one look at the framed photograph I'd finally hung of Cordelia and me at that long-ago ribbon cutting, and said, simply, she'd be unbearable about this, you know. Insufferable. She'd tell everyone she always knew. She did always know, I said. That's the part I keep coming back to. She left the plant and half a sleeve of the good tea on my desk without being asked, the way she has for 15 years, and told me to lock up when I was done, the way she has for 15 years, and I understood watching her go that I had never once actually been as alone in any of this as Dean's version of me was supposed to be. The Psalter sits in a climate-controlled case in the Copley's main reading room now, its spine properly repaired by a conservator my aunt would have approved of, a small card beside it noting its provenance in full, including the 11 months it spent, unknowingly, in the hands of someone who was never who she claimed to be. I added that last part myself. Cordelia would have insisted on it. The paper, after all, ought to keep its own honest record of who touched it. I keep her last letter framed above my desk now, in my own apartment, in a building 4 blocks from the one Dean kept. Books don't lie, it says in her small, slanted hand. People do. That's why I trust the paper over the person holding it, every single time. I did not need anyone to tell me I was interesting. I only ever needed someone to finally read the whole page. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.